Timothy McKinney was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1999 for the fatal shooting of Officer Dawn Williams outside a comedy club in December 1997. McKinney appealed and won a new trial, which ended with a deadlocked jury. A third trial earlier this year also ended in a hung jury. As part of a plea deal, McKinney pleaded guilty to second-degree murder of the officer. Since McKinney has spent almost 16 years in prison, including 11 on death row, he was immediately eligible for release on time served.
Well, the story obviously goes back to 1997, and the details of the case are so convoluted and complex that I would encourage people to read the case for more background sort of on the facts themselves. But from the start, this was a case that was full of holes. You know, absolutely no physical evidence really linking Mr. McKinney to the crime.
Tell us what happened, what is believed to have happened that night.
Sure. Okay, so to give the sort of short version, on Christmas night, 1997, there was a party at this comedy club called Crumpy's. It was very well attended. Hundreds of people were there. It went late into the night. At around 2:30 in the morning that night, Officer Dawn Williams, who had been working off duty, sort of moonlighting off the books at this comedy club, was shot at point-blank range in the neck. And he didn't die immediately. He was paralyzed and actually spent weeks in the hospital. And sort of during those weeks, you know, obviously the community became very outraged about this crime. There was, anytime a police officer is shot and killed, there's sort of a race to a sort of very quick manhunt. And all eyes sort of focused on Mr. McKinney immediately. And that was because he had been seen having an altercation with Dawn Williams earlier that night. He was outside, he couldn't find his car, he was convinced that it had been stolen, and so he sort of made, according to Officer Williams's partner, made sort of vague, threatening statements that he was going to come back and do something to the club. So eventually his presence became sort of obnoxious enough that they briefly detained him, took down his information on a sheet of paper. That sheet of paper was put in Dawn Williams's pocket, and later on at the hospital, that same sheet of paper was retrieved from his pocket. So it became this kind of golden ticket almost, you know, to sort of solving this crime. And so officers focused on McKinney at the expense of any other suspects, really. And there were numerous suspects who had also been seen that night having an argument, being tossed out of the club for being disruptive. So.
Can you talk about the owner of the joint?
Yeah, so the owner, when I went to Memphis to report this story, I met Donald Crump, who owned the comedy club and who also owns a series of hot wings chains. And it's a very interesting sort of player here, because he was one of the people who had thrown out a person from the club that night. And in the ensuing chaos of that of the crime, he was told that the man he had thrown out that night was the man who had shot Dawn Williams. And so he was very invested in the case and the outcome, because he was following it very closely. Dawn Williams had been a very close friend of his, and in his recollection, he was working at one of his hot wings restaurants the day that Mr. McKinney was arrested. It was only a couple days after the crime, and he decided to leave his restaurant and go sort of see the scene. There was a SWAT team around. It was quite a public atmosphere. The press was there, and so he was watching from the street when they brought out Mr. McKinney, and he looked at him and he didn't recognize him. He said, "That's not the guy I threw out." And so he even turned to a police officer and said, "That's not the guy that I threw out of the club."
Because the officer wanted to arrest him, right? And he said, "Please don't." So he was feeling very guilty.
Absolutely, yeah. So he earlier the man that he did throw out, you know, there was talk of arresting him that night, and Donald Crump stepped in and said, you know, it's Christmas. Don't do it. Just let him go home. And so he believes that, you know, he blames himself largely for what happened. I want to be very clear, though. It's not entirely clear that the man that Crump threw out was the man who shot Dawn Williams. There are a number of sort of episodes like that night. But what's interesting, the significance of what he said is that the police never followed up. He cast doubt from the moment Mr. McKinney was arrested on his guilt and suggested strongly that it could be somebody else. But they never did anything with that information. They didn't follow up.